In this video we're going to learn how to perform subqueries with Django, and we're going to see how to build up nested select statements using Django ORM tools. And notably we're going to look at two expressions in Django. We're going to look at the subquery expression, which allows us to add a subquery to an existing query set, and we'll also see the OuterRef expression. And this is used when a query set in a subquery needs to refer to a field that exists in the outer query. We'll see examples of that later on. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and if you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi link in the description. Let's get started. Now I have the Django documentation open here, and I'll link this below the video. We have a page on query expressions, and if we look at the sidebar here, we've already seen these F objects in this series, but if we go down, we have a section on subquery expressions. So let's click that and we're taken to this page. Now the subquery expression is what we're going to look at in this video, but I'm going to go to this page here, which I'll also leave in the description. This is a page that basically tells us what a subquery is. Now a subquery is a complete select command that's used within another select, update, insert or delete command. And the only difference to the normal simple select statement is that it's enclosed in parentheses. And we can see an example of this if we scroll down on the page here when we're selecting some columns here from a table called person. And we have the standard reference to columns like ID, last name, and also weight here. But we have this additional subquery for another expression that we want to bring out as part of that selection. And in this case, the subquery is getting the average of the weight column from that table and then aliasing that result as average weight. So this subquery here uses the average function, and as it says below, the SQL compiler knows that that will return a single value because it's an aggregation. It's going to return a number, and that's called a scalar value subquery. We don't need to worry about that terminology, but we are going to see how to perform these types of queries with Django. So let's go back to the documentation, and you can see we have here some imports of the OuterRef and subquery object. We're going to see how to use them just a bit later in the video, but what we're going to do to start with is we're going to open the database browser for SQLite. I'm going to bring that onto the screen now, and these are the tables that we've been working with throughout this series. I'm going to look at one table right now, and that's the sale table. So we can browse that table and we can see the data that we have in the table. We have a column that is a foreign key column to the restaurant that contains the foreign key ID to that restaurant table that we also have in this database. Now what I'm going to do in order to demonstrate a subquery is I'm going to write two subqueries here, and the first one is going to look at this sale table. Let's say that we wanted to get all of the sales for only Italian and Chinese restaurants. If we go to the other table, restaurant, in this database, you can see that there's a restaurant type, IT for Italian, CH for Chinese, IN for Indian, and so on. Now if we go back to the sale table here, you can see that we have a restaurant ID column, but let's say we only wanted to get the rows for those Italian and Chinese restaurants. So I'm going to write an SQL query here, and I hope you can see this query on the screen. The text is a bit small, so apologies for that. We're going to select all of the columns from the sale table, and we're going to define a subquery in the where clause. So we're going to look at the restaurant ID, and we're only going to get restaurants whose ID is in the results of this subquery that we're about to define. So the subquery, I'm going to move that to a new line and tab it over. It's going to be another select statement, and because we're defining the where clause on the restaurant ID, I'm going to return the ID column from the core restaurant table. And what we're doing is we're going to use another where clause within the subquery, and we're going to check that the restaurant type is one of these values. So I'm going to use the in operator, and it's Italian, which is IT, and Chinese, which is CH. And once we've done that, we can close off the subquery, and that is the query we are about to execute. So let's execute that query, and we get back some results from the database here. But you can see we don't have as many rows as we had before. This time we have 51 rows in the table, and this subset is only the sales that represent sales made for Italian and Chinese restaurants. So let's look at the query. We're selecting all of the columns from the sale table. You can see that here in the result set. And then within our where clause that's going to filter the rows in that table, we're checking that the restaurant ID is in the set of IDs that's returned from this subquery. And again, the subquery, as it said in the wiki page, that can be any kind of select statement. The only difference is it's enclosed in parentheses, and there's an outer query which you can see here. Now let's try and write this query with Django. You can see at the bottom that we have 51 rows. Keep that in mind because we're going to try and get those same 51 rows from the database using Django. Now I have VS Code open here, and this is the script that we've been working with in this series. What we're going to do now is try and write some code that's going to get back the sales for Italian and Chinese restaurants. And it's very easy to do this in Django. We don't actually need to use the construct subquery that we have imported at the top. Let's show the very simple way to run this query. It's going to be sale.objects.filter, and the sale model has a foreign key to restaurant, and we can then follow the reference to that foreign key and look at the restaurant type column, and we can check if that's in a set of values using the in lookup in Django. Now the values we're looking for here, I'm just going to hard code the strings. It's Italian and Chinese, so that's the query that's going to get back those sales. So let's store that in a variable called sales, and then we're going to print the length of these sales, or the number of sales that are returned from the database, and we can execute the script at the bottom. So let's run that script, and you can see when that completes we get back 51 rows, and that matches what we had in SQLite database browser here, and that's the same set of rows. It's only rows for Italian and Chinese restaurants. Now we can verify that we only have Italian and Chinese restaurants in this query set by taking this statement here, and we're going to write from the sales query set that we got back. We're going to use the values list function to extract the restaurant's restaurant type value, and then we can call .distinct on that to get back the distinct values from the database on that column, and we're going to print those to the terminal. And let's run this script and see what we get back. We get back a query set containing Italian and Chinese, but the other restaurant types are not part of that query set, so we can see that this has worked. The sales that we've extracted here with this line of code are only for Italian and Chinese restaurants. So I'm going to remove this print statement, and this is the query that we can write, the very simple Django query that follows the foreign key reference to the restaurant model. But what we can also do is write this using the subquery object that we've imported at the top. So let's see how to do this, and remember this might not be the best way to do it, but it's going to introduce these objects. Now I'm going to change this statement up here. We're going to look at the restaurant type, but we're going to use the restaurant model here in order to do that. So let's store the results of that in restaurants. What we're doing here is we're filtering the restaurants to only Italian and Chinese restaurants, and the restaurants that are returned from this query set, imagine they form the inner select statement, the nested select statement, and we're going to look at the IDs that are returned from this query set in the outer expression. So let's now write the outer expression where we look at the sales, and we're going to use the sale model in this case, and it's going to be .objects.filter, and we're going to look at the restaurant foreign key on the sale, and we're going to look for restaurants that are in the subquery that we've defined above. So we've got this restaurant subquery, but we want to take the primary key values, that's the foreign key value from that subquery, so we can use the .values function and we pass in the primary key column there. This will give us back the primary key values for all restaurants that meet this condition that are Italian or Chinese. And for all of these primary keys that are returned, we use those values as a list, and we use the in lookup to check that for each sale the restaurant foreign key is one of those primary keys. So we're using the subquery construct to do that. And to verify that we're getting the same results here, let's print the length of the query set that we're getting back, the sales, and we can re-execute the script, and we're going to see 51 here as before. Now that's one subquery. What we're going to do also here is define another one. Now you can see in this SQL statement, the subquery is part of the where expression, but the subquery can actually be part of the selection itself, and that's in this part of the query here. We're going to see that now, and the problem that we're going to look at here, if we go back to the database structure and go to the restaurant table, we have a set of restaurants. Let's imagine we wanted to add an extra column to this table, and that column returns the income generated from the restaurant's most recent sale. Now the sale model has that foreign key to the restaurant, and we also have a date time column here. So for each restaurant we want to get the set of sales for that restaurant. We want to order them by the date time column in descending order and get back the most recent sale and annotate each restaurant with that most recent sale. So what I'm going to do is go back to the SQL tab here, and just to save some time in this video, I'm going to paste this in here. This is the query that we're going to execute. We're getting from the restaurant table the ID of the restaurant, the name of the restaurant, and its type. And as well as those three columns, we have a subquery here that defines another value. So let's look at the subquery. We're selecting the income from the core sale table. Now the sale table is not the same table as we're doing the initial selection over, so we're getting the income from that table, and we're looking at the restaurant ID, which is the foreign key in that table, and we're checking if that's equal to the outer query's restaurant ID. So when the query first runs and we get a restaurant with ID 1, the inner query here is only going to return the sales where the sale restaurant ID is 1. So in other words, where the foreign key is equal to 1. And when we get back those sales for that restaurant, we're ordering them by the date time field in descending order. And to get the most recent one, we're limiting that to a single result and aliasing that column or that output value as last sale. So let's execute this query and we can see the results that we're getting back. We have the 3 columns from the restaurant table, but we now have this extra column that's been generated by the subquery here, and that gives us back the value or the income of the last sale that was made for each restaurant in this database. And this is exactly what we do when we annotate objects in Django, when we add an extra piece of information, an extra field to the returned data set. In this case, that extra information is the income generated by the last sale. So we're now going to go back to VS Code and we're going to see how we can write this query with Django. So I'm going to remove the code that we wrote before, and let's start by fetching all restaurants from the database with the restaurant.objects.all query. And for each one of those restaurants, what we want to do is annotate each one of them with the income generated from its most recent sale. So we're going to have to use these subqueries in order to do that. We've imported subquery and also OuterRef at the top. We're now going to use both of these objects. So let's define the query below. We're going to start with the inner query or the subquery itself. Now the subquery for each restaurant is going to fetch the sales associated with that restaurant. And when we have those sales, we can look at the most recent one if we order it in a particular way in order to get the most recent sale. So let's define a variable for sales, and we're going to use sale.objects.filter here, and we're going to filter over the restaurant foreign key here, and we're going to use this OuterRef construct which refers to the value in the outer part of the query. Now the outer part is going to be each restaurant that we're iterating over, and we want to filter the sales by that restaurant's ID, basically its primary key. So we're going to refer to the primary key field in this OuterRef object. The OuterRef object works very similarly to the F object in Django. We provide it with a field, but that field refers to a column in the outer part of the query. We'll come back to that idea in a second, but once we've filtered out the sales down to only those for the restaurant in the outer part of the query, we're going to order those results by that date time column in descending order. And to get it in descending order, we can use the minus in front of the field name. Django is smart enough to know that that means get the most recent first. So what we've written there, that refers to the subquery or the nested select statement that we're going to look at. And then we need to define the outer query here. So let's write a comment. This is the outer query, and we're going to take the restaurants that we fetched above, and we're going to annotate each restaurant with its most recent sale by using this subquery. So let's refer to the restaurants that we've already fetched, and we're going to use restaurants.annotate here. And let's call the annotated field last sale income, and we're going to set that equal to a subquery. Now the sales that we've defined on line 11, that's a Django query set. We can pass that in to the subquery expression here, and what we want to do is, because we're getting the income from the sales that are associated with this restaurant, what we want to do is use the .values function again, because we're only interested in a single column from that subquery. We're going to pass the income column in there, and in order to get the most recent sale, we can use a Python slice here, and we can get back only the first value in that particular query set. So this slice here is going to remove all but the very first object in that query set, and then we are going to look at the income field there, and this is basically going to return the income generated from the restaurant's most recent sale, and it's going to do that for every restaurant in the query set. Now to verify we're getting something back here, I'm going to iterate over each restaurant that we have in this query set, and we're going to print out that restaurant's annotated value. So it's going to be restaurant.lastSaleIncome. Now once we've done that, I'm going to rerun the script. I'm going to make the terminal bigger here so we can see the output of this script. For each restaurant, we get back the value from the last sale. And if we go back to the print statement, and I'm going to turn this into an F expression here, we're going to print out the restaurant's primary key here so we can refer to it in the database as well. And then we can close the F statement off here and rerun the script at the bottom. So let's have a look at the values back here. We have for the primary key of 4, a value of 67.63. Let's go back to the database browser, and for the restaurant with the ID of 4, you can see that that matches the value we're getting back from this raw SQL expression. So let's go back to the code in Django and just quickly go over this one last time. We're fetching all restaurants from the database, and then we define the subquery that we're going to use here in order to get back all sales that are associated with each restaurant. And we're annotating each restaurant with the value from that subquery by looking at one particular column, and that's the income column, and we're slicing in here at the very first value, and that is going to give us the most recent sale because we've ordered the subquery by the datetime field. So this is the inner query or the subquery that refers to the outer value of the restaurant's primary key to filter these sales down, and then that subquery is used within the outer query, and in this case it's where we are annotating each restaurant with that last sale income. Now we can also add additional expressions to this annotate object, and these additional expressions can also use the subquery construct. So I'm going to copy this line of code down twice here, and we're going to see something else here. We have, as well as the income, and expenditure column in the table. So let's refer to the expenditure column in that subquery, and what we're going to do is change the name of the annotated field here to expenditure, and at the bottom I'm going to define another annotation called profit, and we don't need the subquery for this one. I'm going to remove this code here, and instead of that we're going to use f objects in Django to refer to the previously annotated values. So in order to get the profit, we need to take the income from the last sale, and we can subtract the expenditure from that last sale as well. So again, we'll use an f object, and we're going to refer to last sale expenditure. And don't forget the commas in this expression here, because we're passing multiple annotations. We need to separate them with a comma. We also need to import the f object from django.db.models at the top. So once we have the f object imported, we can look at this statement again. We're taking all of the restaurants and we're annotating them, this time with multiple values. One for the last sale income here that we saw before, but now we also have the expenditure from the last sale as well. And again, in order to get that, we use the subquery, and we're referring to that query set sales that we generated above, but this time the subquery is going to extract the values from the expenditure column, and it's going to get the most recent one again by slicing in and getting that first element. And then we have two annotated values. We can use the f objects below for a third annotation for the profit, and we can do this subtraction here between the last sale income and the last sale expenditure. So that's covered some concepts here on subqueries and outer refs. Let's go back to the Django documentation on subquery expressions, and actually I'm going to scroll to the top here, and we're going to go to the sidebar again, and there's a section on exists subqueries, so let's click that. Now there's a class in Django called exists, and that is a subquery subclass, and this will translate to the SQL exists statement. And in many cases, as it says here, this will perform better than a subquery, since the database is able to stop evaluation of the subquery when a first matching row is found, and that's because exists returns a Boolean value. So if you have a single match, you know it's true. Otherwise you might have to perform a full table scan in order to find out that it's false. Subquery can help you though, because if it does find a match, it's going to instantly return the result. So let's use this within our code here. I'm going to clear out all of the code that we have here, and I'm going to change the statement for the restaurants, and we're going to use the filter function. And let's add a comment above here to explain what we're going to do. We want to filter the restaurants down to only restaurants that have any sales with an income of greater than 85. So let's say this is some magical number that we want to get restaurants that have sales greater than that value for whatever reason. Let's see how to do that now using the restaurant.objects.filter function. And at the top, I'm going to import the exists object from Django, and we're going to use that here within this query. And remember, that's a subclass of the subquery expression that we've been seeing in this tutorial. We're going to define that now using exists and instantiate that, and we can pass another query set in there as the subquery. So the query set we're going to pass in is going to check if there are any sales that are greater than 85 for that restaurant. So in this filter statement, we're going to refer to the foreign key on the sale model to the restaurant model, and in order to filter down to the restaurants that are in the outer query, again, we need to use this OuterRef construct, and the key that we're going to use here is the primary key. So the field is going to be the primary key here. We're checking if the restaurant ID is equal to that restaurant's ID that we're iterating over in the outer query. And we also want to add another filter here. We're not just checking to see if the sales foreign key matches the outer restaurant ID. We're also checking if the income in the sale table is greater than 85. And that was part of this clause here, we're checking to see any restaurants that have sales with an income of greater than 85. And that is all we need to do in that query. So let's evaluate that query, and we're going to get the number of rows that are returned using the .count function. And let's clear the terminal at the bottom and rerun the script. You can see we get back 10 rows from that restaurant table. So there are 10 restaurants in the database where there exists a sale for that restaurant with an income of greater than 85. So the subquery here is checking for any sales with an income of greater than 85 and also filtering those sales to whatever restaurant we are at as we iterate over all restaurants in the database. We're checking for the existence of any sales that match those conditions for each restaurant, and the restaurants are defined in the outer query here, which is restaurant.objects.filter. And if we increase this value here to, let's say, 115 and save this, let's see what we get back here. We get back 0, and I think that's because the maximum income in the script that was generating this data was 100. So if we change it to, let's say, 93 here, and rerun the script, we should see hopefully a couple of values but less than 10. And if we scroll down, we have a connection.query statement here. We can actually uncomment that, and we're going to check what kind of SQL is being generated by this query. So we're getting the count of all rows that are returned from this query. We need to look at the where clause here, where we use the SQL exists statement. And we have the subquery here where we're selecting 1 as A from the sale table, where that sale table's income is greater than 93, and also where the sales restaurant ID is equal to the restaurant table's ID. Now this is the key line of code that's defined by the OuterRef expression. So if we look at the OuterRef here, we have the primary key being referenced from the outer table, which is the restaurant table. That's exactly what's going on in this query here. The restaurant ID here is the one in the sale table, and that's the foreign key to that restaurant table. And the second part of this equality is checking for the outer table, which is the core restaurant table. And you can see that referenced here in the normal from statement in SQL. That restaurant table has an ID, and that's how the outer ref is constructed, by looking at the inner table and comparing the values in that column for the inner table with the value on the outer ref or the outer query. And I think it's worth analysing some of these SQL statements and trying to write your own, both with SQL and Django, in order to fully understand these objects and also the concept of a subquery, and particularly how to write them with Django. It can take a little while to sink in how to do this, but it does make sense in the end. Now we can quickly show another example here. I'm going to comment out connection.queries, and we're going to change this query here that's using the exists statement. And this time, instead of sales, let's say we wanted to find all restaurants that had a 5-star rating. So within the exists subquery, we're going to change the model to rating, and we're going to check for all ratings where the restaurant has a rating of 5 stars. So we can remove the income part of this subquery. We need to keep the outer ref because we need to get the ratings foreign key to the restaurant and make sure that that matches. Once we have that, we also need to check for the actual rating itself. We need to check if it's equal to 5 in that exist clause, and we can execute that, and again we can see the output at the bottom here. And if we make this a little bit bigger, you can see that we have 4 results in that query set. So there are 4 restaurants who have at least 1 rating with 5 stars in the database. Now, an interesting thing that we can do with the exists operator is we can actually invert that, because it's a Boolean operator. Rather than exists, we can use the tilde before that, and that means that we are going to check if this does not exist. So in other words, we're going to get all restaurants from the database where there does not exist a rating of 5 stars for that particular restaurant. So let's again save this file and rerun the script below, and we get back 10 this time. Now there are 14 restaurants in the database. The first query returned 4 results. This one is the inversion, the opposite of that query, and it's returning 10 results. So we can negate this exists operator, and that will change the underlying SQL to not exists. And again, the expression that we're passing into this exists object, that's the subquery that we're defining and sending to the database. Now let's do one final example in this video. We want to get all restaurants that had sales in the last 5 days. So I'm going to remove this code here, and at the top you can see we've imported the time zone object from Django.utils. What I'm going to do is define a variable here that represents 5 days ago by taking the current time with timezone.now and subtracting a time delta of 5 days. What we're now going to do is define our inner query here and get back all restaurants that had sales in the last 5 days. So let's define that subquery now. It's going to be sale.objects.filter, and again we're going to be looking at that restaurant foreign key here, and we're using the OuterRef over the primary key column here to look for the sales that match the restaurant in the outer part of this expression. And again we need to define another part of this filter. We're going to look at the datetime column, and we're only going to get back sales whose datetime is greater than equal to 5 days ago. So this is the inner query that's going to give us back all sales that were made in the past 5 days for each restaurant as we do a table scan over each restaurant in the database. We can now define the outer part of the query by setting a variable here called restaurants. That's going to be restaurant.objects.filter, and this time we're going to pass the exists object, and to the exists object we can pass the query set that we defined above here that contains for that restaurant all of the sales where the foreign key matches that restaurant, and also sales that were made in the past 5 days. That's the query set that's provided, and then exists is going to return a boolean. So for each restaurant, if that boolean evaluates to true, it will be kept in the resulting query set, otherwise it will be filtered out. So now that we've written that, let's print out the number of restaurants that we're getting back and execute this script. This time we're getting back 5 restaurants that have sales that were made in the past 5 days. So that's the last example in this video. We've seen how to perform subqueries using SQL and also with the Django ORM, where we have a subquery, an OuterRef and an exists object that we can use to define and perform these subqueries. And these can be very powerful if you want to annotate or filter your objects based on more complex conditions. Subqueries are very common in SQL. It's very useful to know about as a back-end programmer. So thank you for watching this video. In the next video we're going to look at database transactions with Django. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.